seats trying to fall asleep. I know it's real snoozy and comfortable back up in there. We are going to spend a few weeks looking at the parables. I've always liked the parables just because of the storytelling aspect of it, and the ideas and the concepts. We'll look at what parables we're going to study. I'll show you down on the other side towards the end of the class. A parable, for all intents and purposes, is an earthly story with a spiritual meaning. And we'll look at Matthew 13:10, where Christ outlines what his purpose of the parable is. Like I said, it's fairly interesting. The Hebrew word, or the application, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, is Michelle. It's basically commonplace illustrations that touch the heart via the imagination. And you got to remember that Jewish culture is different than ours. Like have you ever been in a discussion and someone asked you to describe God, and what do they say? If I was to ask you, give me something that describes God, some words.
All powerful.
Okay, powerful. Spirit. Okay. Whereas in Jewish culture, they're going to have big descriptions, like, able to move mountains, creator of all, different things like that. So very picturesque. And that's how the parables are set up. Basically simple stories, riddles, fables that define the unknown by using things that are familiar to us, especially to the individuals that Christ was speaking to at that particular time. Now, the Greek parabole, to cast alongside, illustrations, comparisons, reality. It's basically the idea of throwing it alongside, comparing it to something. So those are kind of your definitions of a parable. The parables are designed to challenge the mind. One of the things I was reading is the difference between the Jewish thought and the Greek. The Jews were looking for, or Jewish culture is looking for an answer. They ask a question, they're looking for a specific answer. Whereas the Greeks, they just wanted to argue. I mean, they didn't care if they came up really with a resolution. They wanted to argue. They wanted to argue the point. I think it was one of the things I read, was it Socrates or Plato that they had took to him? Anyway, I'm trying to remember which one. That's basically why he was killed, is because they said he was just a gadfly. I mean, that he just argued and argued. You ever been around somebody like that? You just go away. Just leave me alone. Move along. And so that was part of their culture. So it's a little bit different in the ideas in what they were thinking. The parables are designed to challenge the mind on the highest intellectual level by using, like we were talking about, simple stories. A lot of the stories are familiar to them especially, and we can make application in our lives as well. The history of utilizing stories, parables, is something that's found throughout the Bible. If you will turn to 2 Samuel chapter 12, we'll look at one that's probably one of the most well-known. Basically, utilizing a story to make a point. Instead of just coming in and saying you're wrong, you tell a story and convict the person without them really realizing it. And this is a prime example. The Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said to him, there were two men in a certain city. So he's starting off with a story here, right? Okay? The one rich, the other poor. The rich man had many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing but one little ewe lamb, which he had bought. And he brought brought it up. He grew up with him and his children. It used to eat his morsel and drink from his cup and lay in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now there came a traveler to the rich man, and he was unwilling to take one of his own flock to prepare for the guest who had come to him. But he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. Okay, so that's his story. That's his setup. So what does that story tell you? How does that impact you? You got a rich guy who's got everything. You got a poor man who's got one ewe who loves it dearly. And what does the rich man do?
Take it.
He takes it. He takes it. Now, look how David responds. Then David's anger was greatly kindled against the man. And he said to Nathan, "As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb fourfold because he did this thing and because he had no pity." So David's, boy, he's fired up. He's the king. He's going to make sure this guy pays for this awful, awful crime. I mean, he's fired up about it. And what does Nathan say? You are the man. What? Thus saith the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel. I delivered you out of the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if this was too little, I would add to you much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord, to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Amorites. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me. You have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will rise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor. And he shall lie with your wives in the sight of this sun, for you did it in secret. But I will do this thing before Israel and before the sun. So he basically sets him up. He tells him this story, and he knows how he's going to react. Okay? And David reacts just as he thought he would, with anger. And he wants revenge. And then Nathan turns it on him and says, dude, it's you. And that's how, so this idea of telling a story and making an application, we're going to look at some other parables from Jewish culture as well, are pretty common to the Jewish people. And so when Jesus starts using the parables, it is something they're familiar with. It's not something that they just is new to them. Plus, you have to realize about close to 1/3 of everything that Jesus says is in the form of parables. So it's got to be pretty important for us to try and have a good concept of those things. Like I said, these are quite common. They're very descriptive stories. We talked about how we describe God, whereas in Jewish literature, colorful descriptive phrases are used to describe God. God is not simply powerful, but he who kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and rises up. God simply just doesn't free a group of people, but he leads them out of a house of bondage with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. So, whereas we would use maybe one word description of something, the Jewish culture goes into a very descriptive, very colorful language. We find that in what book? Very colorful, very descriptive book of Revelation. Book of Revelation. You know, the author tries to use descriptive phrases that we really can't comprehend. You know, streets of gold and all these things. But he's trying to utilize things that we're familiar with and describe something that he can't even really describe, but he's doing the best he can with a reference that we can refer to. And the parables are much the same way, utilizing common everyday things and making a spiritual application for those so that we can remember those things. It makes it easier for us.
and that goes kind of hand in hand, not only with the descriptive nature of it, but the use of hyperbole to totally kind of blow things out that is used in a lot of the parables. You know, for instance, the camel through the eye of the needle, things like that.
Yeah. And we utilize some of the same things we'll look at here in a minute. The idea of one of the notes in several of the commentaries I was reading, with being Thanksgiving and everyone did a lot of cooking, right? Cooking, pies, cookies. Matthew's one is like a lot of eating. In the context of 1/3 of everything that Christ said was in parables. Emerald made a couple of cakes for Thanksgiving. What if she had left out 1/3 of the ingredients? Would it have been a cake? Probably not much of one. So we need to make sure that we incorporate the idea and understanding of the parables and truly understand what he's trying to get us to get across. Studying the parables help us to understand the heart and soul of Christ's teachings. One of the other things that I found was a couple ideas or concepts within the Jewish teaching ideas. The first one is, again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but the Haggadah and the Heklica. And Haggadah is the emotional side, the heart. The other is the logic, is the mind. And I'm going to read, well, I can just tell you the parable, I don't have to read it to you. They, within the Jewish religious culture, there was contention, which was better. You know, one would say, well, this is a much better way to teach. And the other side would say, oh no, you've got to go with the logic side of it. Then they came up with a parable. In this book, I found this really interesting book. It's the parables from the viewpoint of Jewish tradition. It's really interesting. But he talks about that the rabbi comes up with this parable to address that very issue. And the story is that there's this man, he has two mistresses. One is very young, one is a little bit older. Well, these two mistresses have different viewpoints, kind of like the Haggadah and the Heklica. The older mistress wants to pull out the black hairs in his scalp and in his beard because she doesn't want people to think that she's dating someone younger or with someone younger than her. His younger mistress wants to pull out the gray hairs because she doesn't want people to think that she's with an older man. So what's the result? He's bald. Okay? One's pulling out the gray hair, one's pulling out the black hair over time. Not that there's anything wrong with that. He ends up being bald. So what's the application?
Keep your hands off my hair.
Both were right, I guess.
You got to have both. You got to have both. If you nitpick on one, you end up losing both. Okay? If you fight amongst yourselves, you end up losing both. And so that's an interesting story that they utilize to make the application. You've got to have both aspects of it in order to make application. There was another. Okay, this was an interesting parable from Jewish culture. It's called The Rabbi and the Exceedingly Ugly Man. Now I'm sharing several of these to show you that this idea or the concept of teaching with parables is not foreign to them, okay? It's something that they've used for a long time. On one occasion, Rabbi Eliezer, son of Rabbi Simon, was coming home from Migdal Gedor from the house of his teacher. He was riding leisurely on his donkey by the riverside and was feeling happy and elated because he had studied much Torah. There he chanced to meet an exceedingly ugly man who greeted him. "Peace be upon you, Rabbi." He, however, did not return his greeting, but instead said to him, "Raka, empty one, or good for nothing, how ugly you are! Is everyone in your town as ugly as you are?" The man replied, "I do not know, but go and tell the craftsman who made me how ugly is the vessel which you have made." What did he just say? Who makes us all?
Blaming God.
Yeah. When our Eliezer realized that he had sinned, he dismounted from the donkey and prostrated himself before the man and said to him, "I submit myself to you, forgive me." So instead of maybe a lesson on how to treat everyone equally, or not judge, we say what? Don't judge a book by its cover. Okay? He's telling this story to make a point. And the point comes across in story form, and they catch on it pretty quickly. Yeah, and I told you the story about the I'm sure, the woman. Yeah. It's basically the parable of the man with two wives. When Rabbi Emmy and Rabbi Asi were sitting before Rabbi Isaac the smith, one of them said to him, will the master please tell us some legal points? While the other said, will the master please give us some hometical instruction? When he commenced the hometical, which is the Hadidic discourse, he was prevented by one, and when he had commenced a legal discourse, he was prevented by the other. He therefore said to them, I will tell you a parable. To what is this like? To a man who has two wives, one young and the other old. The young one used to pluck out his hair, his white hair, whereas the old one used to pluck out his black hair. Thus he remained bald on both sides. So again, the application is both of them are good. You can't say one is above the other. Okay? So they have this type of history in that. Okay? Here's another one. It's called the heron and the lion, and I'll tell you the application here in just a minute. Thereupon the sages decided, let a wise man go and pacify the congregation. Now, the application here is, this is during the time of the occupation of Jerusalem and the Jewish state by Rome. And there are people who are grumbling, and they want something done. They want the Romans out, okay? And so instead of trying to convince them, he tells them this parable. Then let Rabbi Joshua b. Chanawaya go to his master of scripture. So he went and talked to them. A wild lion killed an animal, and a bone stuck in his throat. Thereupon he proclaimed, I will reward anyone who removes it. An Egyptian heron, who has a long beak, came and pulled it out and demanded his reward. Go, replied the lion, you will be able to boast that even you entered the lion's mouth in peace and came out in peace, or unscathed. What's the application?
You got out unscathed.
Yeah. We might say don't poke the bear, right? Okay? So the lion's basically saying, yeah, your reward is, I didn't kill you. Okay? And it goes on to say is, let us be satisfied that we entered into dealings with this people in peace and have emerged in peace. So basically, leave things well enough alone. Okay? So again, it's a story form of trying to make an application of what's going on. Okay, this is a Greek fable or parable. It says, better to lose the ox than catch the thief. A cattle driver in a remote part of the forest was searching for a horned bull that he had lost. He made a vow to the mountain roaming nymphs that he would offer up a lamb in sacrifice if he could catch the thief. coming over a ridge, he caught sight of his fine bull being feasted upon by a lion. Then the unlucky fellow vowed that he would bring an ox to sacrifice if he succeeded at getting away from the thief. What's the application?
Sometimes thank God for unanswered prayers.
Yeah. Be careful what you ask for. Get it?
Leave good enough alone.
It says here, from this we may learn not to pray to the God for something ill-considered, moved by grief brought on us temporarily. So be careful what you ask for in the time in which you ask it. The parables. Now, if you go to Matthew chapter 13, Matthew chapter 13. Christ, and we're going to look at this before we actually look at the parables. Starting in verse 10, he basically outlines the purpose of the parables. Then the disciples came to him and said, "Why do you speak to them in parables?" And he answered them, "To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to one who has, more will be given, and he will have abundance, but from the one who has not, even when he has, will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Indeed, in the case of prophecy of Isaiah, is fulfilled that says, you will indeed hear, but never understand. You will see, indeed, but never perceive. For this people's hearts has grown dull, and their ears they can barely hear. Their eyes they have been closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, I would heal them. But blessed are those, for they see, for your ears, and they hear. For truly I say to you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, and did not see it, and hear what you hear, and did not hear it." So these parables are a bridge between the physical and the spiritual. And he uses these to try and help them to understand. The utilization of story form is paramount. How many teachers do we have in here? Do we have, Jim, I know you were a teacher. Let me ask you something. Depending on your age. You're driving down the road, beautiful day, bebopping along, and a song comes on the radio that was your favorite song in high school, and you turn it up. Can you sing along and remember every single word? I can. Yeah. Most of them, yeah.
Tainted Love, I used to love. Honk the horn and beat on the steering wheel. My kids make fun of me. That's from a dad's song.
Yeah. We can, I think me and my whole family, you pull up an Eagles song, we can sing along word for word, just about every one of them. It's a way of learning. I was on Netflix not too long ago, and there's a documentary on how the mind works. And part of it was talking about they're individuals who have photographic memories and eidetic memories, but there are other people who have trained themselves to be able to remember like large amounts of information. And so they started studying these people, and it went into a lot of detail about, you know, the brain exercises that they do to expand their ability to remember. And they were trying to figure out, okay, what do these people do specifically? They would create stories or make up directions.
In
And
the first place.
yeah. And so what they did is they did an experiment. They got, I don't know, 20, 25 words, just random words. And they had half the group do just general memorization, just like, you know, what you do in high school, you just memorize it, okay? And then the other half they instructed them to either make up songs or make up stories in order to try and remember them. And they gave them a certain amount of time, and then they tested them. The people who memorized, just straight memorization, which is kind of what we're taught sometimes, 13% had recollection. Guess what the other side was?
93.
93%. 93% recollection. So what does that tell us?
Rote memory isn't very effective.
It's not very effective. But doesn't it go back? We know that Christ was a master teacher, and he's using a masterful style of teaching to get us to remember ideas and concepts that we need to be making application in our Christian life. And that's what this class is going to be about. It's about taking these parables and not just understanding and pulling them apart. I'm not real concerned about that. I'm more concerned with understanding and making application in our lives. Jim, you were asking about this word right here, bunkai. Okay, it's not Hebrew. It's actually Japanese Okinawan, and it's something that Tommy and I utilize in our martial arts training. And it's the idea. I think I looked up. Analysis or disassembly to process, conceptualize, and to understand all aspects. It is not memorization. It's familiarization. It's the ability to take an idea and you want this in a surgeon. If you have a doctor who's operating on you, you want him to understand how to do it, but you also want him to deal with an emergency. Something happens during surgery, you want him to be able to react to it quickly, okay? That's the same idea in what we do on our Thursday night class. Tommy can tell you, we'll do a technique and we'll do something, or I'll do something, and they'll say, I bet you've done that 1,000 times. No, this is the first time I've done it, because I understand the principles. And that's basically what Christ is trying to do for us through these parables. He doesn't want us to memorize laws and regulations and guidelines. He wants us to have it in here. He wants us to react instinctively. You see somebody who needs help, you react, you help them. You have a decision to make, whether to do this or to do that. You automatically do what's right, because it's not something you have, okay, what's the rule on that? What do I need to do in this situation? No. It's because you know it in here. And that's what the parables hopefully are designed to do, to help us to understand. We have, everyone remembers Aesop's fables, right? Right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I need some feedback there. Thank you, Karen. And the fables, the difference between these is often it's what? It's stories of animals talking, animals in situations. The fox and the goat. One day a fox fell into a deep well from which he could not escape. Just as he was about to give up hope, a goat came by to quench his thirst. Seeing the fox in the well, the goat exclaimed, "What in the world are you doing in that well, old fox? Haven't you heard the great news of the drought? As soon as I heard, I jumped down here where the water is cool and plentiful. It's delicious too. I have drunk so much I can hardly move." When the goat heard this, he jumped into the well, and the fox immediately jumped on the goat's back, up his horns, and scrambled to safety. Moral: it's not safe to trust the advice of a man in difficulties. It was a war between the birds and the beasts. The bat swore allegiance first to one side, then to the other. Having wings, he could easily claim kingship with the birds, but whenever his feathered comrade seemed on the verge of defeat, he pointed to his fur and joined the beast instead. Eventually, peace was declared, but both birds and beasts remembered the bat's disloyalty and refused to include him in their celebration. "Go away, you're not one of us," each side told him, and they drove him out into the night, where he inhabits to this day, sleeping and traveling in darkness where none can see him. Moral of the story, serving two sides pleases neither. So there's all kinds of different applications with, okay, this is one of my favorites, the ant and the grasshopper. The grasshopper took ease in his field all summer long, chirping and singing, while his neighbor the ant plodded the dusty road, carrying kernels of wheat to his nest. "What a stupid oaf to work in this heat," thought the grasshopper. "Summer is a time for fun." But when winter came with icy blasts, the grasshopper was cold and hungry, and came shivering to the ant's nest begging for food. "Help me, I'm starving," cried the grasshopper. "Are you not the same grasshopper who was lazy and played in the fields all summer?" asked the ant. "Yes, I am," said the grasshopper. "Since you sang all summer," replied the ant, "you can dance all winter. Prepare for the days of necessity." So you have all kinds of different applications. Now, we have modern day parables, okay? Anybody watch the Andy Griffith Show? Anybody not watch the Andy Griffith Show? I guess that's maybe. Some of my favorite episodes. It's Opie and the Birdman. What happens? Do you remember? Opie accidentally, he's got the slingshot. He accidentally kills the mama bird, and which I always kind of thought this was kind of harsh, but Andy comes up and opens the window to Opie's bedroom and lets him hear those baby birds crying all night. I always thought that was kind of rough. But what does Opie do? He goes and gets the baby birds. He takes care of them. He feeds them until the point that they're old enough to fly off on their own. So to me, it's a story about redemption. Okay? Now I don't know if this is the title of the particular episode. One of my favorites, the coat drive. It's where the ladies' auxiliary is collecting money for winter coats, and the woman comes in and she's trying to get the money for the coats, and it's actually more than one story. There's also a woman in it she thinks her husband has died, but he's not really gone. He just kind of went away, and she made up a story. She buried an empty casket because she didn't want to admit that he had left her. But as far as Opie, he's only given, I think, like 2 cents. And Andy's just on him and won't let him explain it. You just Mr. Skinflint. How does it look for me, the high sheriff, and my own son is only given 2 cents? Will you just take your money and you do this? And finally, he's like, "But Paul, I'm saving a coat. I'm saving my money to buy a coat for my girlfriend because she doesn't have one." And at the end of the episode, I love this. They're sitting around the table, and Aunt Bee, was kind of laughing about it a little bit. She walks in the kitchen, and Opie says, "Paul, what are we having for dinner?" And he says, "Well, son, you're having chicken. I'm having crow." So it's about pride. Responsibility. Bailey's Bad Boy. About a young man, Bill Bixby, who, after he left Mayberry, he went and got exposed to gamma radiation and became the Hulk. But that's another story. But it's about a young man who breaks the law, and they put him in jail, and his daddy's rich and powerful, and through the process, Andy teaches him responsibility. He's got to stand up on his own 2 feet. In the story, he talks about Opie breaking a window and Andy telling him, "Well, you are not going to get your allowance until you pay for that window." Okay? And the young boy comes to Andy and says, "Man, weren't you kind of rough on the kid? can't you just bail him out? And he says, no, I can't. Because if I bail him out now, what's going to make the difference when he gets older? He's not going to know the difference. And that boy catches on to that, and at the end of the story, the lawyer comes in and is trying to get him out, and he says, no. Basically, he says, I need to pay for the window. And so, it's a responsibility. And then Opie and the Bully, about a little boy who is taking Opie's milk money, and you know, you struggle with that as a parent, but Andy tells him a story about how he stood up, and it's a lesson in courage and fear and how to deal with those things. And so I can watch the Andy Griffith shows over and over and over again because of that pure fact. And I read a story that when Andy Griffith started that show, that was his purpose, that he wanted every story to have a moral, to have a purpose. It just wasn't, not just entertaining, but just about every one of them, especially the early ones, had some type of application. And you'll remember those applications because that's how our brains work, right? 93% as opposed to 13%. We remember those things, okay? So it's easy for us to pick up with those types of things. This idea, this concept, this concept of using stories is something that we can identify with, that is easier for us than just memorization. And it's an idea or a concept that Christ is trying to utilize to get across to them. Any thoughts, any questions? You sure? None whatsoever. Now, we will not be able to look at every one of these parables. Time won't allow it. I'm less concerned about trying to discuss all of them as opposed to whatever ones we can get to understanding them thoroughly. Kind of divided them up. Several of the commentaries divided them up in different ways. I kind of took part of what they did and divided them up very similar. There's 9 here, and that's what we'll start off with, that basically you could label them the kingdom or the church. And it gives us ideas or concepts, concepts from us as the church, our behavior, our the things, how we need to be viewing the kingdom. This one, no man left behind, which is pretty obvious. The lost sheep, the prodigal son, the lost coin, the persistent widow. Our behavior, the unforgiving servant, the 2 sons, the wedding banquet, the good Samaritan, the Pharisee and the tax collector. Wisdom and folly, the 10 virgins, the rich fool. Now, the rich man and Lazarus, that's always been kind of, is it a parable or is it not? Would you agree, Matt? Some commentaries will say it's not a parable. Some will say it is, but we're going to include it because of the lesson that it teaches. It's kind of like one of the commentaries looked at the mustard seed and the leaven. We generally see that as a positive thing, right? Okay? One of the commentaries, which I don't agree with per se, is that it's not a good thing. That the leaven, and I'll tell you a little bit of story about the leaven. The mustard seed, for a tree to get that big, it would have to be abnormal. And then he relates back to the leaven as far as with the Passover. What did the Jews have to do during Passover leaven? Yeah, they got it completely out of the house. So he sees it more as a negative I don't think it fits with the narrative, to be honest with you. I did read an interesting story about, well, it's not a story, it's a fact. One of the little websites and notifications that Brian hooked me up on is the Chabad, which is a Jewish website. Goes over all their, their the history and their celebrations, and the leaven. Okay, during the Passover, I get this email, and it talks about the leaven, and getting it out of your household, right? Okay. Well, then it goes on, and this isn't a story. This is like someone asked the question. They say, Rabbi, whatever. I've got expensive liqueur in my house. Okay? And it has wheat in it, apparently. I don't know how it's made, but apparently there's leaven in the process, so there is leaven in this liqueur. So by Jewish command, what should they do with that? They should throw it out, right? Not so much. Okay, so basically this rabbi, and I should have printed it off, what they do is you have a bill of sale, okay? I'm Jewish, Tommy's not, okay? So come Passover, I fill out this bill of sale, and I list all these liqueurs I'm selling to my Gentile friend, Tom, okay? And I mail it to him, I fax it to him, whatever, okay? But once he has that in my hand, has that in his hand, I no longer own that liqueur. It's not mine. Now what do I do with it? I put it somewhere in my house, in a cabinet, and I seal it. Okay, with tape or whatever, but it's sealed. I can't get to it. Okay? It never transfers hands. But legally, we talked about the legal aspect, it's Tommy's. Now, after the Passover, what happens? Tommy gives me that piece of paper back, and I say, thank you very much, and I go unpackage my liqueur, and it's all fine and good. And so that's that legalistic side, okay, of that aspect, okay? What we're going to look at,
Yeah, that was the goal.
was it? Okay. Okay. For next week, look at, in Matthew 13, in chapter 13, look at the parable of the sower, the parable of the weeds, the parable of the hidden treasure, just those parables in chapter 13. Look at those, okay? And that's where we will start off. We'll work through these. The hidden treasure and the pearl kind of go together because they're very, very short, but they have a really significant meaning, okay? So that's where we'll start. Read Matthew chapter 13, and that's where we'll pick up on the parables, okay? Lots of discussion next week, okay? Good. Thank y'all very much.
I was worried it might throw him.
I'm Joey.
Joe and Dana.